I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Ms Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Follow that, I think, is the first question. Let me try to. Let me start by saying often the British public would rather talk about sex than debt. Both can equally cause a lot of trouble, though. A 2019 study showed the majority of people in this country believe it's easier to talk about miscarriages than it is about money. How much that has changed in recent years when the cost of living has become the top topic of conversation for millions of people because they are drowning in debt. Indeed, they are now the majority. In my own constituency of Walthamstow, nearly 55,000 people are in financially vulnerable circumstances. That is 58% of my local population and way above the national average of 38%. But the truth is, debt is suffocating millions of people in this country. It's not just a North East London phenomenon. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation in October recognised that there were 7 million low-income families in this country going without the essentials in the last 6 months, including 5.5 million who are experiencing food insecurity in the last month. That is a fancy term for starving themselves because they could not afford to put food on the table. 4.3 million low-income households are in arrears on at least one household bill or credit commitment. And 14 million people in this country have less than 100 quid in their savings. One piece of Lego stuck in the washing machine and they are done. Now, some would say that having debt in response to this is manageable. And it is for some people. That's how they've gotten through this crisis. But that's not the one in four people every minute, one person every 4 minutes is declared bankrupt or insolvent in this country. The Registry Trust estimate 4.6 million people have one or more CCJs. They are issued at a rate of 2.5 times more in lower income communities like mine than higher ones. And at the end of last year, lenders wrote off £573 million of debt, of which £291 million was credit card debt. That's £3 million a day being written off because people just will never pay it back. 4 million households hold a loan they originally took out to pay for food or housings worth around £9.6 billion. And £2.3 billion of this is owed on bills that have a massive consequence if you don't pay them or you fall behind. Council tax, rent or mortgages, energy bills. The kind where you end up losing your home or end up with the bailiffs at the door. It's not hard to see why, because this isn't profligacy. There is just too much month at the end of many people's money. High inflation since the end of 2021 has baked in higher prices in areas such as food, and energy costs are rising again. Private rents have continued to increase ahead of inflation, up 8.7% last year, higher in places like Walthamstow. Interest rates might have seen 2 cuts, but the full impact of elevated interest rates is still feeding through into mortgages. Yes, the legacy of Liz Truss will be felt for decades to come in the empty pockets and multiple evictions. So sue me for saying so. The government set up a financial inclusion committee with consumer groups and financial institutions to look at how to provide individuals with poor credit histories access to safe and affordable credit. Because in this target-rich environment, there is much for the legal loan sharks in this country to feast on. And feast they are. Low-income households in this country owe £23 billion in unsecured loans and credit cards. That's up from £19 billion in just May last year. 2.2 million low-income families have high-cost credit loans, like payday loans or pawnshop arrangements. And 3 million people told Ipsos last year that somebody in their family had gone to an illegal lender in the last 3 years. Banks don't want to lend to these people because they're seen as a bad bet. And it's because of the cost of living crisis, because they just can't get hold of the money to keep things moving. And our credit union movement, which has been promised so much by so many different governments, just cannot grow to keep up with the need. It's been as ripped off as the Wongas or the Klarnas are a rip-off by governments who've promised to invest in it and yet failed to do so. Now, I pay tribute to groups like Fair for All Finance, who provided funding for credit unions like the London Capital Union, which works in Walthamstow. But no credit union can compete with the online lenders who are pummelling our constituents on their phones, on their websites, offering them unprotected credit to get through to the end of the month so that they can buy a pizza. Then they stick them with late repayment fees and charges before lending to them again, even though they can't repay it, because they're stuck in a spiral of unaffordable debt. So in all this debt, the most important thing you can do is talk about it. And that means you need somebody to talk to, because it can be the critical difference between getting out of the hole that you're in and burying yourself even further. Now, the FCA imposes a levy on all regulated financial services companies to pay for such support, and that includes funding the Money and Pension Service. Others, such as the CAB, who many of us I know will pay tribute in our constituencies, and Step Change, have to fundraise for themselves. But frankly, ultimately, in this environment, we can't afford to keep funding failure. We need to prevent people getting into debt in the first place and move them off this high-cost credit that causes so much of it. But so few people in the current environment get the help they desperately need to get out of this nightmare. The 2018 Independent Wyman Review found that just 1.1 million people got debt advice. Just 13% of those considered indebted. By 2020, it was estimated that now 1.7 million are getting help. The government set a strategy of 3.7 million by 2020. But just last year, the Money and Pensions Advice Service only saw 2 million people. It's not through a lack of trying. 82% of debt advisors told MAPS that there'd been a large increase in demand, while just over half of them reported a decrease in the resources to cope with it. And that's the nub today. Because the total funding available for debt advice in this country in 2018 was 196 million, with about a third of that coming from that financial levy, and the rest coming either from local government or fair share creditors. Frankly, the payments that you get in a debt repayment plan to pay for services. We now know that the Financial Services Levy is raising around £78 million. So we have no idea what is happening to the rest of the money needed, not least because we know local government itself is on its knees after 14 years of Conservative cuts. Indeed, my own local authority is cutting the support it offers to people struggling with council tax payments, let alone providing any debt advice. They're not alone. Exeter CAB has seen a £125,000 cut to its services, Woking CAB a £189,000 cut. Coventry Independent Advice Service, a council grant for £325,000. The numbers go on across the country. Funding will get harder too because of the cost of living crisis, because more and more people cannot afford in the first place to make a debt repayment plan work to provide the funding that keeps this going. The CAB say that half of those people they work with have a negative budget. 66% of money advice users are in that position. So there is a risk that we will not get the funding to get people out of this hole. The Money Advice Service need to get involved in cases earlier, but a consultation by the previous government last year on the future of this service said looking at the cost of the overall advice service should be and what the scope should be was out of scope. Above all, it is scandalous, given how implicated they are in the debt problems in this country and the length of time it has taken to get even close to some kind of regulation for them, that the buy now, pay later companies, the Klarnas, the Clearpays, the Laybys of this world, don't even contribute to this pot because they aren't a form of regulated credit. So not only are constituents going without protection from them from the Ombudsman when they are missold products, they aren't even paying for the damage that they do. Yet around 1/3 of people who need debt advice have buy now, pay later debt. That is why I am urging the government, especially in the light of delays in regulating these companies, who had a windfall this last Christmas and will have a windfall next Christmas too, by the signs of it, to consider a windfall tax on the buy now, pay later companies themselves to help pay for the debt advice so desperately needed. Now, the companies have written to me claiming they're not against being regulated, which is odd because I was at the Labour Party conference where they stood on a platform and claimed so. But they've also said they're happy to contribute to making donations toward debt advice. So let's take them at their word and squeeze them as much as they have squeezed our constituents. We also have to stop commercial companies which make millions of pounds from pretending to be debt solutions consumers, claiming that they are helping rather than pushing them further into debt. At the very least, the Insolvency Service should regulate these companies. Frankly, I would prefer a law which ensured that you could not make excessive profits from somebody else's personal debt by capping their charges. And sickeningly, many buy now, pay later companies present themselves as a money management service. That's why I'm also asking the government to develop measures for lenders on what they are doing, not only to reduce financial exclusion, but also ensure they are not the cause of debt themselves through bad lending practices. Even America, that great bastion of communist thinking, does more. The Community Reinvestment Act gives lenders an explicit obligation to meet the needs of all borrowers in those localities, including those on low incomes, to help stop them being the main meals of illegal loan sharks in the first place. And that's why we also need to make sure that the Money and Pensions Advice Service doesn't become primarily a website and helpline. Tackling debt in communities means people in communities, especially given the variation in debt between areas. That doesn't uphold the principle, if it's just online, about helping those most in need, and especially the most vulnerable. And this matters because when you look at the numbers of people who would benefit, it comes very clear. In 2021, the Money Advice Service defined their needs as the people who were behind on one priority bill or facing bailiffs. It separated out from that those people they thought just needed money guidance, tips on how to budget. But those are people building up arrears, and they were, as they recognised, at a tipping point. 8 million people are listed as needing debt advice, but a further 13 million are at this tipping point. Now, any of us who've ever had someone come to our constituency surgery in financial difficulty knows the sooner you intervene, the more chance you have of success. With 21 million people at a tipping point, let's not let them tip, let's help them now. Research by the Centre for Responsible Credit shows these people are already under extreme financial pressure. They're frequently borrowing to make ends meet. They use buy now, pay later, unauthorised overdrafts, and are already behind on their consumer payments. If we underestimate the numbers of people in debt because this bigger group are better at juggling, can we really say that's not a problem? To be constantly borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, Paul to pay Penelope, Penelope to pay both of them. Millions of people in this country are one bad argument with their partner, one new school uniform item needed, one parking fine away from being unable to manage. And they've just been through a month where everyone spends on average an extra 700 quid because it's Christmas. They don't need us to judge them, they need us to help them. If we don't massively increase the funding to the money advice services and ensure their focus is on preventing debt in local communities, this won't just be personally devastating for millions of people, this will hamper our chances of getting economic growth. Because ultimately what I'm asking the ministers to do is a cost-cutting measure. The National Audit Office reported in 2018 that debt problems are so detrimental to the well-being of the British public, they lead to higher public spending on both welfare services such as mental health and state-subsidised housing to the tune of £900 million a year. And that's why ultimately I think we need a financial inclusion committee, not just to look at the costs of credit, but to look at how we stop people getting ripped off in the first place. To be a consumer champion across the piece, whether on energy deals, finance, or even local public service debt advice provision. Because in the end, if we join up the dots, we really will save everyone money. And that's the one thing right now that nobody has.
Sarah Russell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a pleasure to follow my honourable friend, the member for Walthamstow, who spoke incredibly passionately about the difficulties of debt. And there is a lot of debt in my community. It appears on the face of it to be relatively affluent, and that is one of the problems, is that actually people feel a huge amount of compulsion to maintain that appearance. And there are a lot of people who I have spoken to on the doorstep and in the course of the submission that we did as a constituency to the Child Poverty Commission, about the fact that actually people are really, really underlyingly struggling and finding it incredibly difficult, and that in areas like mine, where there is not a perception of poverty, that there are simply no services to assist people who need help. So my constituency has no Citizens Advice Bureau anywhere in the constituency, no law centre, nothing. So when people do have difficulties, they don't know where to turn. And I want to say three things about this. One is that we need to do the best that we can to improve civil legal aid, because fundamentally Citizens Advice Bureaus were partly funded by local government, which was cut, and partly funded essentially through the legal advice work that they did that was charged at legal aid rates. And unfortunately, since those are now so difficult to work under, all of these advice services have been decimated. And my local Citizens Advice Bureau spoke to me. I say local, as I say, it's not in the constituency, although they occasionally can do in-person, transitory work. But they spoke to me about how important it is that they can see people face to face, that vulnerable people, older people and other people who in theory might have online access but still can't actually really go through a complex system to resolve their debt if they don't have that consistent face-to-face assistance. So we need to be aspiring not just to improve telephone services, online services, but make sure that what we're providing is in-person advice for people. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is something that my friend touched on very briefly, is about the quality of the advice that people are receiving, and about the fact that although the FCA do now regulate the products, and they are products that people are being sold around debt reduction, that they are products, and that there is a real problem with mis-selling of these, despite the theoretical regulation. Unfortunately, regulation is only as good as the enforcement. So I would say that it's very, very important that we keep up discussing this matter and that we bring forward real change to the advice landscape, because our residents need us to.
Thank you. Minister, James.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And let me first congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Walthamstow, for securing this debate. And I very much recognise and have seen over the years the work that she has done to raise the profile of responsible consumer credit practices and effective debt advice. I'd like to also thank my honourable friend, the member for Congleton, for her contribution in this debate, and specifically for raising the experience of her constituents. Madam Deputy Speaker, credit, when offered responsibly, can be an essential tool for people who are having to manage unexpected costs or who need to smooth their cash flow. And as a government, we want to support consumers in having access to credit when they need it. But at the same time, we are determined to make sure access to credit comes with robust protections to ensure that lending is affordable and that consumers are protected when things go wrong. That is why, in October last year, we published a consultation on a proposed regulatory regime for buy now, pay later products. This regime will introduce better protections for millions of consumers and will bring buy now, pay later firms into the regulatory perimeter of the FCA. Now, this in turn will mean that firms offering buy now, pay later products will be required to pay specific annual FCA fees and levies. And amongst these is the Financial Guidance Levy, the proceeds of which funds free debt advice services. Now, as I turn to the importance of debt advice, I would like to begin by paying tribute to the thousands of debt advisors across the country for the critical work they do to provide support for those in need. Intervention... Yes, I will.
I think
Stella, Creasy.
Just on that point, we all value the debt advisors. As he's just said, buy now, pay later companies don't yet contribute to the levy that pays for these people, but they themselves have said they would make voluntary contributions. Would the Treasury consider approaching them ahead of them being part of the regulatory landscape to get that money so we can have more of these brilliant debt advisors?
James Murray.
I thank my honourable friend for her question, and I'm sure that the Treasury officials and indeed my colleague, the Economic Secretary for Treasury, will be in close contact with the sector about any proposals they have. But I think it is important to emphasise that because of the regulations which we're consulting on the new regime, this will mean that buy now, pay later firms will be required to pay those specific fees and levies, which will help fund free debt advice services. We know that funding those services is so important because intervention through debt advice services not only provides for prevention from financial difficulties from escalating, but it also protects people's overall mental health and their well-being. And more widely, of course, there are positive effects for families, communities, and the economy at large. Now, as a new government, we're committed to supporting national and community-based services through the Money and Pensions Service, or MAPS as it is commonly known. These services provide advice to hundreds of thousands of individuals and families in need in England. And in December, MAPS published its first debt advice impact report, which showed that across 2023 and 24, people accessing debt advice through MAPS-funded services gained an estimated £48 million of extra income. Now, this underlines, Madam Deputy Speaker, the fact that for many people, advice not only allows them to deal with their debt problems, but also helps them to find a way forward with more money in their pockets. This applies to England, and of course outside of England, the UK government provides funding through the Financial Guidance Levy to devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And as debt advice is a devolved matter, the devolved governments have responsibility for delivering these services within their nations and for tailoring the services for the needs of their local communities. Now, as has been raised by my honourable friends, there is a gap between those who need debt advice and those who are currently accessing it, and the government recognises that gap and the need to tackle it. I should first say that funding levels, which were raised by honourable members, are regularly reviewed to reflect demand, inflation and evolving need. The debt advice budget for MAPS for the upcoming financial year will be communicated in the usual way in the spring, and I will make sure that my honourable friend is informed. Furthermore, my honourable friend, I think, mentioned the MAPS consultation last year on the future of its debt advice commissioning strategy. MAPS' response to that consultation was published in October. It set out MAPS's commitment to increase debt advisor wellbeing, to further build advisor skills, and to deliver digital transformation across the debt advice sector. And as part of its efforts to address unmet need for unmet demand for debt advice, MAPS has also launched its Debt Advice Modernisation Fund. This is a grant initiative designed to support projects aimed at enhancing and modernising debt advice services within the not-for-profit sector. The projects are currently underway and they will be completed by the end of March. Now, more widely, my honourable friends touched in this debate on issues around financial inclusion, and I'd like to assure my honourable friends that the government is taking further steps to ensure that individuals can access the financial services they need. In December, I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. In my constituency, we have an organisation, a voluntary organisation called the Whitmoreens Welfare Centre, which happens to be in Whitmoreens, and their job basically is to signpost individuals to get the debt advice that they need. In the past, they've had a part-time, full-time caseworker, and funding was received for that, but they're finding it increasingly difficult to be able to provide that one-to-one advice that was mentioned earlier, which is so useful for residents. Can the Minister give any advice on how organisations of that nature can be helped so that constituents can be helped by giving that one-to-one advice and so that they can be signposted as well?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for raising the case from his constituency and for highlighting the important work that the organisation he referred to does for his constituents. Obviously, individual funding decisions are a matter which I can't comment on from the dispatch box, but I think what he really highlighted is the importance of tailoring to local need. So there may be a national priority to make sure that we have debt advice provided to people, but individual local debt advice agencies, debt advice services, will need to make sure they're tailoring for the needs in their community, and he's an excellent advocate for his constituents in that regard. And I think as well as the debt advice services, which this debate has focused on, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I was saying, I think that making sure individuals can access the financial services they need is important too. And that's why in December the government announced its intention to develop a financial inclusion strategy. That strategy will aim to further tackle barriers for individuals and households' ability to access affordable and appropriate financial products and services, and the strategy will be supported by a committee which my colleague, the Economic Secretary, convened for the first time in December, and which will consider the problem of debt. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to briefly turn my attention to the work the government is doing in carrying out support for vulnerable individuals and businesses who repay debt to the public sector. The Government Debt Management Functional Centre, based in the Treasury, convenes a debt fairness group. This is a collaboration with the debt advice sector that identifies opportunities to continuously improve public sector debt recovery processes. The Functional Centre's work includes debt management toolkits, which support public sector bodies dealing with those facing physical and mental health challenges, and to help them identify and support the 8.7 million adults in the UK who have experienced economic abuse. In closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to once again thank the Honourable Member for Walthamstow for raising this important discussion, and I have no doubt she will continue to be a champion for the issues which we've discussed. The Government remains committed to providing accessible debt advice and promoting financial inclusion. We are committed to ensuring everyone has the support they need to manage their finances effectively and to build a more secure future for themselves and their family.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. Order, order.